Hello there, and welcome to the Sleepy History Channel. Tonight we travel back, far further back than any human memory can reach, to listen for a single sound rising through cold air. Somewhere in the northern world tonight, on a ridge buried under fresh snow, a grey wolf has lifted its head toward the dark sky. The stars above it are sharp and unblinking. The spruce trees stand heavy with white, and nothing moves for miles in any direction. And the howl that leaves it climbs slowly, unhurried, hanging in the frozen air like breath, drifting out across valleys where nothing else stirs. It is one of the oldest songs the living world still sings. For this is the opening chapter of something far older than you might imagine. The lineage that shaped that howl reaches back tens of millions of years, long before the first human fire was ever lit, long before our own kind walked beneath these same stars, before there were names for anything, before there were eyes like ours to watch. That sound, or something very like it, was already moving across the cooling continents of a younger Earth. And so, in a quiet way, this is the opening chapter of You Too, of the long companionship between our kind and theirs, of every dog that has ever slept beside a person in the dark. So let your thoughts soften as we ask the gentle questions. What shaped that sound across so many ages of ice and forest and grass? What kind of world did it first echo through when the map of the land itself looked nothing like our own? And who was listening in the long dark before any of us were here to hear it at all? If you enjoy these gentle journeys, I invite you to like, subscribe, or share a thought below. It helps others find their way here too, one sleepy soul at a time. But for now, simply settle in. Let your shoulders ease into the warmth around you, and let the cold ridge and its single howl fade into the background of your mind, a distant candle in a vast and patient night. Because to understand that one wolf, breathing slowly on its snowbound ridge, we have to follow its story all the way down to the root, down past the ice ages, past the first wolves, past the first true dogs, down to the very base of the great branching tree of meat-eating creatures, where the story begins in warm and ancient forests with a small animal you would scarcely recognize. There, tens of millions of years ago, in a world drowsy with heat and green, the first faint outline of the wolf was already waiting to be drawn, written quietly into bone and breath, while the continents themselves were still finding their places. We will travel that path together slowly, with nowhere to be and nothing to hurry toward, the way a river travels at night, without effort and without sound. So breathe out now, and let the journey carry you gently back through deep time. Imagine, for a moment, a warmth that has nothing to do with summer, a deep, green, breathing warmth that lay across the whole of the Earth roughly 50 million years ago, in the long age that geologists call the Eocene. There were no ice caps then, not at the poles, not anywhere. Palms grew in places that now lie buried under Arctic snow, and forests of broad-leaved trees reached almost to the ends of the world. The continents themselves were still drifting, still finding the shapes we would one day recognize, the great land masses pulling slowly apart across an ocean of time. If you could stand in that forest, you would feel the air thick and wet against your skin, hear the drip of moisture from leaves the size of dinner plates, and smell the rich, dark rot of the forest floor, the smell of a world utterly alive and entirely indifferent to the fact that no one was there to name it. This is where the story begins, not with a wolf, not with anything that could be mistaken for a wolf, but with something small moving quietly through the canopy overhead, far above the forest floor, Among the tangled branches and the dappled green light, there lived a group of small creatures that the fossil record remembers as the miacids. You would not have looked at one and thought of a wolf. You might not have looked at one for long at all. They were modest animals, low to the branch, long in the body, something like a weasel or a pine marten in their shape and their soft, secretive movements. Some were no larger than a squirrel. They padded through the trees on flexible limbs, hunting insects and small reptiles and whatever soft, slow things they could catch among the leaves. And they slept, most likely, curled into the hollows of trees while the warm rain fell. Their world was a vertical one, a green architecture of trunk and branch and hanging vine, and they knew it the way you know the rooms of a house in the dark, by feel, by habit, by the small certainties of a body perfectly matched to its place. Above them, the canopy closed like a roof, and below them, far down through the layered shade, the forest floor lay in a permanent soft twilight that the sun could barely reach. And yet, in the quiet machinery of their bodies, something remarkable was already taking shape. Deep in their ankles, in the small bones where the foot meets the leg, an unusual flexibility was evolving, a particular looseness of joint, a way of turning and gripping and absorbing the shock of movement. It was a trait that suited a creature living among branches, where every step is a small negotiation with gravity. But that same ankle, that same patient gift of flexibility, was the distant beginning of something else entirely. It was the first faint rehearsal of a foot that would, tens of millions of years later, carry a wolf at a tireless trot across a frozen plain, mile after mile, through the longest nights the world can offer. The miacid did not know this. It could not know anything of the kind. It simply lived and moved and slept, and in doing so carried forward a blueprint it would never see completed. From this modest beginning, across spans of time almost too vast to feel, the great branching began. The miacids and their kin stood near the root of a family of mammals that we now call the carnivorans, the order to which cats and dogs and bears and seals and weasels all belong. And here it helps to slow down, to let the scale of it settle, because this branching was not a sudden flowering, but the slowest unfurling imaginable. Across millions upon millions of years, the lineage divided and divided again, each split separated from the next by stretches of time longer than our entire species has existed. One deep branch would lead, eventually, toward the cats and the hyenas and the mongooses, the feliform line. Another would lead toward the dogs and the bears and the weasels and the seals, the caniform line. They grew from the same ancient root, these two great limbs of the carnivoran tree, the way two boughs of an oak grow from a single trunk and then reach, over the years, toward entirely different parts of the sky. There was no moment of decision. There was no creature that woke one morning a cat and went to sleep a dog. There was only the slow drift of generations, the quiet accumulation of small differences, the patient sculpting that time performs on every living thing when no one is watching. A single one of those quiet intervals between the great divisions would swallow the whole of recorded human memory many times over, and still leave room to spare. The branching happened in a silence so complete, across a stillness so long, that to call it slow is almost to misunderstand it. It was less an event than a kind of weather, a climate of change moving through the living world at a pace no eye could ever follow. As the Eocene wore on, the world began, very gradually, to change its mood. The great warmth that had wrapped the earth for so long began to ease. The planet was cooling, almost imperceptibly at first, the way a long summer evening cools after the sun has gone down. You cannot name the moment it happens, only notice eventually that the air has turned. By the time the Earth had passed into the age we call the Oligocene, roughly 30 million years ago, the forests were thinning in places, the climate was drying, and a new kind of landscape was beginning to open up between the trees. And it was here, in this cooling and opening world, that the caniform line took on a clearer shape, the deep ancestral stock from which, much later, the whole dog family would grow. North America was its cradle. On that ancient continent, among forests giving way slowly to more open ground, the early caniforms moved and fed and raised their young across countless unrecorded generations. They were not wolves. They were not even yet anything we would call a dog. But the direction of the story had been set. The way a river, far up in the hills, has already chosen the valley it will follow to the sea long before it arrives there. Picture then one of these small creatures on a cool Oligocene morning, a thing no larger than a house cat, perhaps curled in the shelter of a fallen log, perhaps stepping out into the grey light to test the air with a damp black nose. There is nothing about it that announces what it is. It is simply an animal, living its single, unremarkable life in a world that looked nothing like ours. A world with different stars wheeling overhead, different plants underfoot, different shapes moving in the distance. It hunts, it rests. It will leave behind, if it is lucky, a few small bones for the patient earth to keep. And yet inside that modest body, written in a language it could never read, it carried something extraordinary. It carried, all unknowing, the deep genetic blueprint for every wolf that would ever live, for every grey wolf that would ever stand on a snow-covered ridge and lift its head and send a long note rising into the cold. The howl that hangs in the air on a winter night somewhere in the northern world is, in the strangest and truest sense, an inheritance from this small, forgotten creature in the Oligocene dawn. There is something quieting in that thought, something that loosens the grip of the present hour. Everything that feels urgent now, everything that feels fixed and final, was once only a possibility folded into a sleeping animal on a cool morning 30 million years ago. You yourself are the inheritor of spans just as deep, carried forward by ancestors just as unaware of what they were beginning. The same patience that shaped the wolf shaped you. The same slow, unhurried sculpting across more time than the mind can comfortably hold. And so, the small caniform sleeps in the shelter of its fallen log, the cooling world turning quietly around it, the forest drawing back, the open ground spreading wider with each passing age. It does not hurry, because nothing in this story hurries. It simply waits, as all of deep time waits, for the next slow turn of the wheel, for a world that is growing colder and wider and more open, ready to be filled. Imagine a forest floor scattered with the warm light of an Oligocene afternoon, the ground soft with fallen leaves, the air thick and humid and heavy with the smell of resin and slow decay, and moving low through that undergrowth, no larger than a fox, a small long-bodied creature with a narrow muzzle and quick dark eyes. This is Hesperocyon gregarious, and though no one would have known it then, you are looking at the first true member of the dog family, the earliest canid, the deep root of everything that would one day become the wolf. Hesperocyon appears in the fossil beds of North America around 36 million years before our time, in a world still draped in forest, but already beginning, almost imperceptibly, to change. Its body was lithe and supple, built more for slipping through cover than for running down open ground. and its limbs still carried something of the climbing flexibility inherited from older ancestors that had once moved among the branches. Yet, in its teeth, and in the delicate hidden architecture of its inner ear, the scientists who study these fossils can already read the unmistakable signature of the canids, the family that would carry the wolf's future across the next 36 million years. It hunted small prey in the shadow of giant trees, and it did so, the fossil record gently suggests, perhaps not entirely alone, for the very name gregarious hints at the possibility of company, of the earliest faint stirrings of the social life that would one day define the pack. Imagine it slipping between the great trunks at dusk, its ears turning, its nose held low to the ground, reading the warm earth for the small movements of the creatures it lived upon, utterly at home in a world that has since dissolved entirely into stone and silence. And so, the story of the wolf, in its truest sense, begins here, with a creature you could have held in two cupped hands, padding quietly through a forest that has been gone for longer than the mind can comfortably hold. Now feel that warm forest begin, very slowly, to cool. Across the long stretch of the Oligocene, the earth was drifting into a colder, drier rhythm, and the great unbroken forest that had blanketed the northern world for so long began, over spans of time too vast for any single life to perceive, to thin and to retreat. In the open spaces they left behind, something new spread across the continent's grass. Open country unrolled itself, plains of waving grass stretching toward distant pale horizons, and the canids, ever adaptable, began to answer the quiet invitation of that open ground. The body that had been built for slipping through undergrowth started, generation upon patient generation, to lengthen and to change. Legs grew longer beneath deepening chests. The frame grew leaner, more economical, more upright, shaped now for covering distance rather than for the short ambush among the trees. This was not a sudden transformation, but a slow sculpting across millions of years, the open landscape itself acting as the unhurried hand that drew the canid form outward into something faster, something tireless, something built at last to run. And in that quiet reshaping, you can already sense, very far off, the silhouette of the wolf trotting across a frozen plain, though that plain would not exist for a very long time yet, and no creature alive then could ever have dreamed it into being. Picture then the Miocene unfolding a great green age, the grasslands now firmly established across the heart of the continent, and across them an extraordinary flowering of the dog family. This was the golden age of the canids in North America, a radiation so rich and so abundant that dozens upon dozens of species came into being, filling nearly every corner of the landscape that a dog-shaped animal might possibly fill. There were small, swift forms, little larger than today's foxes, slipping along the edges of the grass, and there were others grown heavy and powerful and slow, and among the most remarkable of them all were the bone crushers, the borophagenes. Imagine a creature such as Hesperocyon, one of the largest dogs that has ever lived, broad-skulled and massively jawed, built with teeth and muscles strong enough to crack open the long bones of its prey and reach the rich marrow sealed deep inside. These were not wolves, and they were not the wolf's direct ancestors, but they were cousins, a parallel branch of the same ancient family tree, and for a long stretch of deep time, they dominated the open country of North America, formidable and successful in a way that must have seemed, had anyone been there to judge it, utterly and permanently fixed in place. Yet permanence, in deep time, is only ever a matter of perspective, only ever a trick of how briefly we are here to look. The bone crushers, for all their power, would eventually fade. Across the slow turning of millions of years, the Barophogenes declined and at last vanished entirely, leaving no descendants at all to carry their heavy-jawed line forward into the world. And as that mighty branch withered and grew still, another, far quieter branch continued to grow, the slender, swift-limbed canids, the lineage of the runners, less spectacular perhaps than the great bone crushers, drawing far less attention to themselves, but built for endurance and for the long, patient chase across open ground. It was this understated branch, the lithe and unassuming descendants of creatures like Hesperocyon, that carried the wolf's future quietly within it, like a secret kept faithfully across the ages. There is a gentle lesson hidden in that long fading, the kind of thing that is easy to feel on the soft edge of sleep, that what endures is not always what seems strongest, that the future often passes unnoticed and unannounced, to the swift and the adaptable rather than to the mighty, and that the slow patience of deep time has a way of choosing very quietly, without ceremony, without applause, without any witness at all. Now imagine the very edge of the continent, far away to the northwest, where land and sea meet in cold grey restless water under a low and colourless sky. For most of this long story, North America had been the cradle of the dog family, an isolated nursery where the canids had been born and had diversified in splendid abundance, largely set apart from the rest of the living world. But the earth is never entirely still, and its great slow rhythms answer to no creature's plans. As the climate cooled and great volumes of water were slowly locked away as ice across the far north, the shallow sea between what we now call Alaska and Siberia drew back, and where there had been ocean, there rose a wide, windswept bridge of exposed land, joining two continents that had long been strangers. Across that bridge, over spans of time measured in countless uncounted generations, animals of every kind began to move, drawn on by hunger and by the simple pull of open ground. And among the travellers, at last, were the canids stepping for the very first time off the continent that had made them and into the vast, unfamiliar reaches of Eurasia. Picture it gently, a small, swift dog, the descendant of all those millions of years of North American becoming, trotting across cold, open tundra beneath a pale and enormous sky, crossing from one world into another without any sense at all that it was doing anything remarkable, simply following the prey, simply following the ground beneath its feet. With that single quiet crossing, the lineage that held the wolf's future spread beyond a single continent and began, for the first time in its long history, its slow and patient journey across the wider earth. It is worth pausing here in the warm quiet to hold a single steadying thought before sleep. For tens of millions of years, a span so long that it resists any honest attempt to imagine it, whole North America was the great nursery of the entire dog family. The continent we now know for its wide prairies and its rolling plains, the land that is presently called the Great Plains, was the place where the canids were born, where they multiplied into their dozens of beautiful forms, where the bone crushers rose and reigned and fell into silence, and where the modest runners quietly inherited the future the giants had let slip from their grasp. Every wolf alive in the world tonight, on every continent where wolves still walk, every single howl rising over an Italian hillside or a snowbound Canadian valley or a silent Siberian forest, traces its deepest origin back to that one ancient American ground. There is something steadying in that, a kind of grounding you can let your full weight rest against in the dark, the knowledge that the long chain of life runs entirely unbroken across such immensities of time. that a small fox-sized creature padding through an Oligocene forest is bound by an invisible thread of descent that has never once, in all those ages, been severed or frayed, to the wolf breathing somewhere out in the cold at this very moment. And you belong to a chain every bit as long and just as unbroken, stretching back through ancestors beyond all counting into the same deep past, the same warm, vanished forests, the same slowly cooling and patient world. And so the first true dogs had stepped out of their cradle and into the wider world, carrying within them, all unknowing, the small bright seed of everything still to come, the long, slow promise of the wolf, drifting outward across the continents like a thought too large and too gentle to finish before sleep. There is a moment in deep time when the bone crushers begin to fade, and a leaner shape steps quietly into their place. And it is here, somewhere in the dry grasslands of late Miocene North America, that the story sharpens toward the animal we know. Imagine a plain washed in pale gold, the grass moving in long, slow waves under a wind that has been blowing across that continent for millions of years, and through it, a small dog-like creature trotting at the easy, tireless pace that its descendants will one day carry across half the world. The genus Canis appears in the fossil record around 6 to 7 million years ago, and what marks it is not size or strength, but a kind of refinement. Where the great Borophagine bone crushers had built their lives around heavy jaws and powerful crushing teeth, these new animals were lighter, faster, more flexible in body, and, it seems, more flexible in temperament. They were built less for overwhelming force than for endurance, for cooperation, for the long, patient pursuit across open ground. In that quiet shift from power towards stamina and sociality lies the seed of everything the wolf would become. No single creature decided this. It was simply the slow accumulation of small advantages, generation after generation, in a world that was steadily drying and opening, until the shape of a runner had been written into the bones. One of the earliest of these new animals to carry the name Canis was Canis lepophagus, a slender, coyote-sized predator that moved across the North American plains roughly 5 million years ago. Its name means something like the hair-eater, and it is easy to picture it that way. A low, quick shadow slipping through the grass after small, fleet prey, its legs already long, its muzzle already narrowing toward the elegant profile we recognize today. It was not yet a wolf. It was smaller, lighter, more like a coyote in build and likely in habit. But in its skeleton, the wolf body plan is already being rehearsed. The deep chest beginning to form, the limbs lengthening, the teeth settling into the balance between slicing and holding that a pursuit predator needs. To stand on that ancient plain and watch Canis lepophagus pass would be to see, without knowing it, a draft of the grey wolf, an early sketch in which the final lines are not yet drawn, but the shape is unmistakably there. From this modest hair-eater, across the unhurried span of the Pleistocene, the line would branch and spread, some descendants staying small and quick and becoming the coyotes that still sing across the American night, others growing larger, heavier, more social, and beginning the long walk toward the wolf. For all that North America had been the cradle of the dog family for tens of millions of years, the wolf's future lay in crossing over into a wider world. During the Pliocene and on into the early Pleistocene, the descendants of these early Canis began to spread westward and northward, drawn across the great land bridge that rose and fell between Alaska and Siberia as the seas retreated and returned. We call that vanished land Beringia, and at the times when it stood open, it was no narrow causeway. but a vast cold grassland, a country in its own right, stretching for hundreds of kilometers between continents, grazed by enormous herds and swept by winds off the ice. Imagine animals moving across it, not in a single dramatic migration, but in a drift so slow, it would have been invisible to any watching eye. A few kilometers of range expansion in a generation, a population edging outward across thousands of years, until what had been an American animal was quietly also a creature of Asia, and then of Europe. There was no crossing in the human sense, no journey with a beginning and an end. There was only the patient outward pressure of a successful animal filling the spaces that the cooling world kept opening before it, until the wolf lineage stood astride two hemispheres at once. And as it spread, it changed, each new land asking something slightly different of it. The cold of the north favouring a heavier build, the open steppe rewarding the long endurance trot, so that the animal that reached Europe was already a little more wolf than the animal that had left America behind. In Europe, as the Pleistocene deepened, this spreading line gave rise to an animal that biologists regard as the direct ancestor of the grey wolf, and its name carries the memory of the place where its bones were first studied. Canis mosbacensis, the Mosbach wolf, named for a site in Germany, roamed across Eurasia from somewhat more than 1 million years ago. It was smaller and more lightly built than the grey wolf that would follow, closer in size to some of today's smaller wolves or larger jackals, but it was unmistakably of the wolf line, a pack-living, far-ranging predator, moving through a continent unimaginably richer in great beasts than the one we know. Picture the world the Mosbach wolf inhabited. Across the cold plains of Ice Age Europe move straight-tusked elephants and woolly mammoths, giant deer whose antlers spanned more than 3 meters from tip to tip, woolly rhinoceroses, cave bears the size of the largest brown bears alive today. Into this immense and dangerous landscape, the Mosbach wolf fitted itself, hunting in coordinated groups, reading the herds, surviving on intelligence and cooperation rather than sheer mass. For hundreds of thousands of years it ranged and adapted, its body slowly enlarging, its jaws strengthening to meet the larger prey of a colder world. And in that slowly changing form, the grey wolf was steadily, almost imperceptibly, taking shape. And then, at last, after this long rehearsal across so many millions of years, the animal itself arrives. The first true Canis lupus appears in the fossil record roughly 300,000 years ago, emerging out of the Mosbach wolf populations of Eurasia. There was no single first wolf, no moment to point to, no morning on which the world woke to find a new creature in it. The change was so gradual that no boundary line could ever be drawn through it. One generation shading into the next, the body growing a little larger here, the skull a little heavier there, the social bonds a little more refined, until at some point that no eye could have marked the animals moving across the tundra were, by every measure we can take from their bones, grey wolves. It is worth pausing on how quiet this arrival was. There was no witness to it. The continents held no creature capable of noticing that something new now walked among them. The wolf simply was, padding across the cold plains of a world filling with mammoths and bison and giant deer, hunting and denning and howling exactly as wolves would still be doing hundreds of thousands of years later, on ridgelines that did not yet exist, under stars that have barely shifted since. 300,000 years is a span the mind can hardly hold, and the wolf has been wholly itself for all of it. There is something deeply restful in that thought, in the slowness of it all. We are used to imagining the appearance of a creature as an event, a sudden arrival, a curtain rising on something new. But the grey wolf did not arrive in that way at all. It became. It was not made in a moment, but eased into existence across a depth of time so great that the becoming itself is the only true story there is. Every feature that makes a wolf, the long legs and deep chest, the endurance, the loyalty to the pack, the voice that carries across cold air, each of these was rehearsed for millions of years before the animal that carries them ever existed. Drafted and redrafted in the bodies of the miacids and the Hesperocyanines, in Canis lopophagus on its golden plain, and in the Mosbach wolf among the mammoths. And there is a strange comfort in remembering that you, lying here in the warmth tonight, are the product of exactly the same kind of patience. You too were not made in a moment. You are the latest line of a story that stretches back through your parents and their parents and theirs, down and down through deep time, along a thread that never once broke, all the way back to creatures that would be as strange to you as the Mosbach wolf would be. The wolf's slow becoming and your own are written in the same long, unhurried hand. So the grey wolf came into the world not with a cry, but with a stillness, a gathering of a form that had been a long time in the making, stepping out at last onto the cold plains of the late Pleistocene, as though it had always been there. Around it, the great Ice Age beasts moved through their own slow lives, and ahead of it lay the coldest chapters the world would offer, the long glacial winters in which the wolf would be tested and tempered into the animal we know. But that is the next part of the story. For now, it is enough to let the wolf simply stand on its plain in the gathering cold, newly and quietly itself, while the wind moves the grass and the light goes soft, and to drift for a while in the long, patient time from which it came. Imagine the cold first, not the gentle cool of an autumn evening, but a cold with weight to it, a cold that presses down out of a pale sky and settles into the ground until the earth itself rings hard underfoot. This is the Pleistocene, the long age of ice that gripped the world for more than 2.5 million years, and you are standing somewhere on its vast northern shoulder. To the north, where the horizon should soften into distance, there is instead a wall of white, great ice sheets a mile and more in thickness, pressing slowly down from the pole, grinding mountains into gravel with a patience no living thing could ever witness from beginning to end. And stretching away from the foot of that ice, all the way to the edge of sight and far beyond it, lies a single open landscape unlike anything on the earth today. The mammoth steppe, the scientists who study it have come to call it, and it ran in an unbroken corridor of grass and frozen earth from the green hills of Ireland across the whole breadth of Europe and Asia, all the way to Siberia and over the land that once joined Asia to Alaska. The air carries two smells braided together, the dry, sweet scent of cured grass, and beneath it the mineral coldness of frozen soil that has not thawed in 10,000 years. This was the world the grey wolf came of age in, and it shaped the animal down to the bone. Picture now a wolf standing in that wind, and understand that it was not quite the wolf you might meet in a forest today. The wolves of the Ice Age were, on the whole, larger and more powerfully built than most of their living descendants. Their skulls were broader and more massive, their jaws deeper, their teeth heavier and more thickly enameled. The dentition of an animal that needed to crack bone and shear through frozen hide, to wrestle down and hold prey far larger than any deer a modern wolf is likely to chase. In the tar at Rancho La Brea, in what is now Southern California, the bones of one such form have been recovered in their thousands. An Ice Age wolf so robust and so specialized for crushing bone that it is now understood as a separate species entirely. vanished with the world that made it. These were not lean shadows slipping between trees. They were broad-chested, heavy-headed hunters built for a landscape of giants, and the giants were everywhere. For this was a world of enormous animals, the like of which the earth has not held since. Imagine the herds that moved across the mammoth steppe in the long blue light of a winter afternoon. The woolly mammoth walked there, draped in a shaggy curtain of hair that hung nearly to the ground, its curved tusks sweeping the snow aside to reach the grass beneath. Beside it moved the woolly rhinoceros, low and massive and armored in its own thick coat, with a great flattened horn it used like a plough. There were wild horses in their thousands, small and tough and shaggy, drifting across the steppe in herds that darkened the grass. There were bison heavier than any alive today, and the saiga antelope with its strange swollen nose built to warm the freezing air before it reached the lungs. And there was the giant deer that some people still call the Irish elk, though it was neither only Irish nor truly an elk. A creature whose antlers spread wider than a tall man, can reach with both arms outstretched, nearly 3.5 meters from tip to tip. A crown of bone so vast it must have been shed and grown anew each year. A fortune of calcium carried lightly through the cold and laid down again every spring. And these were only the grazers. In the caves and along the ridges lived the great cave bear, larger than a modern grizzly, and the cave lion, a pale northern lion without a mane that hunted reindeer and young mammoths in the snow, and the cave hyena, whose dens have given up the gnawed bones of nearly every creature that shared its world. Into this company of giants, the wolf fitted itself, not as the largest predator, but as one of the most enduring. And the secret of that endurance was the pack. Consider what it meant to hunt in this world through the deep heart of an Arctic winter, when the sun barely lifted itself above the southern horizon, and the land lay for weeks at a time in a soft, unbroken twilight, blue at noon and black by the middle of the afternoon. No single wolf, however large, could bring down a bison alone, or test the defenses of a mammoth herd, or hold a kill against the cave hyenas drawn out of the dark by the smell of blood. But a pack could. A pack could spread across a slope and read a herd together, could take turns at the long chase so that no one animal tired before the prey did, could surround and harry and wait, could share the warmth of bodies pressed close in a snow hollow when the hunt was done, and the cold came down hard. And there was more to it even than the hunt. In a pack, the young were not raised by their parents alone, but watched over by older brothers and sisters, fed and guarded and taught through the slow lessons of play, so that the knowledge of how to read a herd and survive a winter was carried forward, not in a single life, but in the unbroken memory of the family itself. This deep cooperation, this binding of separate lives into a single working family, was not invented in a season. It was refined across hundreds of thousands of years of ice, tested in every winter, passed down through countless generations, until it became as much a part of the wolf as its coat or its long, tireless legs. The howl that called the pack together across miles of frozen ground was already, in that age, an ancient instrument. We know these wolves not only from the shapes they left in stone, but from something far more intimate. In a limestone cave at Goyet, in the valley of a small river in what is now Belgium, the remains of Pleistocene wolves have lain undisturbed for tens of thousands of years. One skull recovered there, belonging to a wolf that lived around 36,000 years before our own time, has yielded some of the earliest glimpses of ancient wolf DNA that science has ever read. A thread of genetic memory drawn up out of the deep past, telling us about populations of wolves that ranged across Ice Age Europe long before any of the wolves alive today were born. To hold the idea of that in the mind for a moment is a strange and quiet wonder that inside a fragment of bone left in the dark of a cave, the instructions for an entire vanished population could wait, patient and intact, through every century that followed, until at last someone came with the tools and the care to listen. And what that listening has told us is that the wolves of the ice were not a single uniform people, but a shifting mosaic of populations, some of which faded entirely from the world as the climate turned, others of which carried their lineage forward into the wolves and the dogs that share our nights today. And the populations these wolves belong to ranged across a world stitched together by cold in ways that are difficult to picture from where we sit tonight. At the very depth of the ice, during what the geologists call the last glacial maximum, around 20,000 years before our time, so much of the world's water was locked up in those vast ice sheets that the seas themselves drew back, falling far below their present level and laying bare great plains of land that the ocean covers now. Britain in those millennia was not an island at all. It was joined to the European mainland by a broad, low country of marsh and grassland and slow rivers, so that a wolf could have trotted from the hills of what is now France across to what is now England, without once touching water, across ground that lies today beneath the grey waves of the North Sea. And at the other edge of the world, the same falling seas uncovered a vast bridge of tundra joining Siberia to Alaska, 1,000 kilometers wide in places, a whole sunken country in its own right, so that an animal might have walked, given enough generations and enough patient drifting, from the steppes of Central Asia all the way into the heart of North America without ever leaving dry land. The grey wolf, by then, ranged across very nearly the whole of it, from the drowned plains of the North Sea to the Siberian taiga to the cold corridors of Alaska. One animal moved through the ice-bound world, following the herds, raising its young in snow dens, lifting its voice into the long twilight. There has rarely been a large land animal so widely spread across the face of the earth. It is worth pausing here in the cold to feel how vast a span of time this represents and how small a part of it our own kind occupies. The wolf had already been the wolf for hundreds of thousands of years before the ice reached its deepest. It had crossed continents, weathered the slow advance and retreat of glaciers, buried its dead in caves whose bones we can still read, all without a single witness who would ever leave a written word about it. The whole of what we usually call history, every story ever told around a fire, every name ever remembered, fits comfortably inside the most recent thin sliver of this wolf's long tenure on the earth, that when you next see a wolf, or even a dog dreaming by your feet, you are looking at the living end of a thread that runs back, unbroken, through that frozen world of mammoths and cave lions and twilight that lasted for weeks. A thread your own brief, warm life is a very recent knot upon. And so the wolves move on through the long ice, season after season, hunting and resting and raising their young against the cold, as the glaciers begin their slow and almost imperceptible retreat. The world is warming by fractions of a degree across centuries, and the great herds are shifting their ancient paths. Something else is moving across that landscape now too. A new kind of animal, upright and clever and carrying fire, drawn like the wolves to the herds and to the warmth and to the long open distances of the steppe. But that is a meeting for the chapters still to come. For now, let the picture simply hold. The white wall of ice to the north, the grass cured stiff with frost, the mammoths dark against the snow, and somewhere on a ridge, a pack of wolves lying close together in the blue evening. Breath rising, eyes half closed, entirely at home in the coldest world the earth has ever shown its children. There is a particular quality to the light of a fire seen from far away in the dark, a small, wavering warmth in a vast, cold landscape, the only point of orange in a world of grey and white and blue. Imagine a wolf, perhaps 40,000 years before our time, standing on a low rise at the edge of the open steppe, watching that distant flicker across the snow. It is an animal already ancient in its ways, the product of millions of years of slow becoming, and the thing it is watching is new. Around those first deliberate fires move a creature the wolf has known only recently, in the deep arithmetic of evolutionary time. The anatomically modern human, arriving across Europe and Asia somewhere between 40 and 50,000 years ago, walking into a world that wolves had already held for hundreds of thousands of years. To the wolf, these upright newcomers were simply another presence on the land, another set of movements to read, another scent threaded into the wind. Neither animal could have understood that this quiet mutual noticing, this watching across a strip of frozen ground, would become one of the longest and strangest companionships the living world has ever known. For now, there was only the fire and the cold, and two kinds of hunter sharing the same long winter night. The two species who met on that Ice Age landscape were, in a deep sense, looking at versions of themselves. Both the wolf and the early human were social hunters, bound into family groups that moved and worked as one. Both read the land the way you might read a familiar room, noting which way the wind carried scent, where the herds were drifting, which animal in a moving mass of bodies was lagging, favouring a leg, falling a half step behind the others. Both communicated across distance, the wolves with howls that carried for kilometres over still air, the humans with calls and gestures, and eventually the slow gathering of language. Both cooperated to bring down prey far larger than any single individual could manage alone, and both depended utterly on the bonds within the group to do it. There is something quietly astonishing in this, a kind of mirroring across the species barrier. Two utterly different lineages, separated by tens of millions of years of evolution, arriving by entirely separate paths at nearly the same answer to the same ancient question of how to survive a hard world together. Each knew, in its own way, the patience of the long pursuit, the discipline of waiting for the right moment, the trust that the others in the group would be there when the moment came. When the human looked at the wolf, and when the wolf looked back, each may have recognized, without any way of naming it, a fellow traveler in the same difficult craft. And so, the two hunters shared a landscape, sometimes as rivals, sometimes as wary neighbors, sometimes as something not yet named. They competed for the same prey, the great deer, the wild horses, the bison and the reindeer that moved across the steppe in their seasonal tides. Where one group of hunters made a kill, the other was rarely far away. A wolf pack, finishing with a carcass, might leave enough behind to draw a band of humans. A human group, having taken what they could carry, might leave a scatter of bones and scraps that the wolves would find by scent on the wind. In this slow back and forth, the sharp line between competitor and companion began, almost imperceptibly, to soften. The smell of a human camp, of cooked meat, of marrow cracked from bone, of the warm refuse that gathers wherever a group of creatures lives and eats, would have carried far on the cold air, and to a hungry wolf in the dead of a long winter, that smell was an invitation written in a language older than thought, Some wolves, the boldest or the hungriest, or simply the least afraid, would have begun to linger at the edges of the firelight, just beyond the reach of the warmth, watching, waiting, drawn in. And perhaps, on the other side of that low fire, a human paused in the dark and felt the weight of eyes upon the camp, not with fear, but with a strange and growing familiarity, the sense of a presence that returned, night after night, and did no harm. Tolerance, on both sides, is a thing that grows slowly, the way frost gathers on a window or moss creeps over a stone, so gradually that no one can point to the moment it began. A wolf that was chased off one winter might be ignored the next, and fed, almost without intention, the winter after that. The archaeology of this slow drawing together is faint and difficult to read, scattered across the floors of caves and the buried remains of ancient camps. In a few places, the bones of wolves have been found resting among the bones of the animals that humans hunted and ate, and among the tools they left behind. An ambiguous nearness that hints at relationship without ever quite proving it. At a cave called Goyet, in what is now Belgium, lie some of the oldest canid remains that may speak to this story. Skulls that have given researchers their earliest fragmentary glimpses into the wolf populations moving through that frozen world. Yet the evidence resists easy reading. A wolf bone in a human camp might mean a hunted animal, or a scavenger that wandered too close, or a creature that had begun, however tentatively, to belong. The truth is that we are looking back across an almost unimaginable depth of time at a relationship that left only the faintest of marks, and much of what passed between wolf and human in those long dark winters is simply gone, dissolved into the silence that swallows everything old enough. Somewhere in that silence, in a place and a moment that archaeology has not yet been able to fix with any certainty, something began that would change both species forever. Somewhere between 15 and 40,000 years ago. The window is wide precisely because the event was so slow and so quiet. A lineage of wolves began the long walk toward becoming a dog. It is tempting to imagine this as a single dramatic moment. A wolf cub carried back to a camp, a deliberate taming, a clear beginning. But the truth is almost certainly gentler and far stranger than that. There was no capture, no founding act, no day on which it could be said to have happened. There was only a gradual approach, repeated across generations too slow for any single pair of eyes to witness. The least fearful wolves tolerated a little nearer the fire. The ones that startled least and snapped least allowed to linger, to scavenge, to stay. Across the long unspooling of generations, those bolder, calmer animals had, on average, a slightly better chance. And the simple arithmetic of that small advantage, compounded over hundreds and then thousands of years, began very slowly to bend one wolf lineage away from all the others. This is the deepest truth of domestication, and the one most easily missed. It was not something done to wolves, so much as something that happened among them. An evolutionary current as patient and invisible as the cooling of an age. The wolves that drew near the fire were not choosing to become dogs, any more than the humans were setting out to make them. Each generation simply lived and bred, and the ones that could bear the nearness of people left a few more offspring than the ones that could not. And those offspring carried the same quiet tolerance a little further. Their bodies began, almost imperceptibly, to change. Shorter snouts, smaller teeth, coats that drifted toward patchwork colors never seen on a wild wolf, a lifelong readiness to read a human face. But all of that lay far ahead. The the slow fruit of a process that began with nothing more than a hungry animal deciding on some forgotten winter night that the warmth and the scraps were worth the risk of coming close. The wild wolves, meanwhile, held to their old ways, kept their distance, stayed in the dark beyond the firelight. And so the two lineages, once a single kind, began their long divergence, one walking toward the fire and the other away from it. Consider then the dog asleep tonight at the foot of someone's bed, curled into the same tight circle its wild ancestors made in hollows of snow, twitching faintly through some private dream. Inside that sleeping animal runs a thread of inheritance, mitochondrial DNA, passed down unbroken from mother to offspring across an almost incomprehensible span of time, that links it directly back to a population of Pleistocene wolves, to creatures that lived and hunted and died in the Ice Age dark of 40,000 years ago. The bond that warms that quiet room tonight was not forged in any human memory. It was formed in the cold, beside fires that no one now living has ever seen, by animals whose names we will never know, on nights so distant that the very stars overhead have shifted in their pattern since. Every dog that has ever leaned its weight against a human leg, every one that has ever waited by a door, carries that ancient firelight somewhere in its blood. It is a strange and gentle thought that so much warmth could descend over so many slow generations from so much cold. And the wolf, the wild wolf, the one that stayed in the dark, carries it too in its own way. The animal standing on that low rise at the edge of the steppe, watching the distant flame across the snow, did not walk toward it. It turned in the end and went back into the night, back to the pack waiting in the cold, back to the old hard freedom that its kind had held for hundreds of thousands of years and would hold for tens of thousands more. The fire was not for it, but it had watched all the same, had stood for a moment at the threshold of a story that was just beginning, a story in which it would play both parts, the one who came close and the one who stayed wild. For now, though, there was only the cold and the dark and the small orange light, slowly burning down to embers, while a wolf melted back into the snow, and the long winter night closed quietly over the place where the two of them had stood. The snow comes up to a wolf's chest, where it stands at the edge of the tree line, and for a long moment it does not move at all. The cold has settled into everything, the air, the branches, the pale blue dust that hangs over the ridge, and into that stillness the wolf lowers its head, draws a slow breath, and steps forward. There is no urgency in it. There is only the beginning of a journey that may carry this animal 50, perhaps 100 kilometers before the night is over, across frozen rivers and open plains and through forests where no path has ever been worn. Imagine for a moment the patience folded inside that single first step, the unhurried certainty of a body that was made over millions of years for exactly this. Almost nothing about the wolf is built for speed alone. It is built for distance. It is built for the long, tireless covering of ground that no other large predator on Earth can match. And to understand the wolf at all is to understand the quiet engineering of that endurance, written into every bone and every breath. Begin with the legs, which are long and lean and set close beneath the body, carrying the wolf in a stance that scientists call digitigrade. The wolf does not walk on the flats of its feet the way a bear does, or the way we do. It walks on its toes. Its heel rides high above the ground suspended, and the long bones of what would be the foot in a human have become, in the wolf, an extension of the leg itself, a built-in spring, a lever that lengthens every stride. The front legs are set close together beneath the narrow chest, so that a trotting wolf places its prints almost in a single line, one paw falling neatly where the last had lifted. A track so straight and economical it looks less like walking than like the land being quietly threaded. This is the architecture of the runner, the same arrangement that lets a deer flee and a horse gallop, and in the wolf, it produces a gait so efficient it seems almost weightless. The signature movement of the wolf is not the sprint, but the trot, a steady, rolling, ground-eating rhythm of around 8 kilometers an hour that it can hold for hours on end, through deep snow, across mountain passes, without ever seeming to tire. When the moment demands it, the wolf can break into a gallop and reach perhaps 60 kilometers an hour. But that is a brief and costly thing, spent quickly and rarely. The trot is what it lives by. A wolf moving at its trot can travel through an entire night and greet the dawn many valleys away from where it began. Beneath that motion lies the engine that powers it, and the engine sits inside a chest that is deep and narrow, like the prow of a ship. Where a sprinter's body might be broad, the wolf's ribcage is compressed from side to side and drawn long from front to back. And inside that narrow keel, the heart and lungs are large for the animal's size. An oversized bellows feeding an oversized pump. This is the secret of the endurance. The wolf can draw great volumes of air and drive oxygen-rich blood to its muscles at a rate that lets it hold a steady pace long after another animal would have collapsed into the snow. It is not the body of a creature that bursts and rests. It is the body of a creature that simply keeps going mile after mile, the breath rising in measured clouds, the heartbeat a slow and even drum beneath the fur. And the feet that carry all of this are themselves a small masterpiece of the long road. Each front foot spreads into 4 large forward-pointing toes, splaying slightly with the weight so that the foot widens into something almost like a snowshoe, spreading the wolf's mass across the surface of the snow rather than punching down through it. The claws are blunt and strong and do not retract the way a cat's claws do. They stay extended always, worn smooth by the ground, gripping ice and frozen earth like the studs on a winter boot. Between the toes, the fur grows thick, a small warm webbing that guards the soft pads against the bite of the ice they press into with every step. And tucked higher up on the inside of the leg, no longer touching the earth at all, is the dew claw, a small vestigial toe. A quiet relic of a much older form, of ancestors who once needed it, and descendants who no longer do. It is a little signature of deep time written on the wolf's own leg, a reminder that this body is not a design drawn fresh, but a long inheritance, edited across uncountable generations, carrying forward even the things it has ceased to use. If the legs and chest and feet are built for crossing the land, the senses are built for reading it, and chief among them is the nose. The world a wolf inhabits is, before it is anything else, a world of scent. Inside that long muzzle lies a sheet of sensory tissue folded into an enormous surface, carrying somewhere around 300 million olfactory receptors, against the mere 5 or 6 million that line a human nose. The difference is not one of degree, but of kind. The wolf does not simply smell more strongly than we do. It perceives an entire dimension of the world that is closed to us, a landscape of information drifting on the air. On a still night, with the wind moving the right way, a wolf can detect a single deer from as far as 2 kilometers downwind, and it reads far more than mere presence. In a scent, it can find the direction the animal is moving, how long ago it passed, whether it is young or old, whether it is strong or carries the faint chemistry of sickness or injury. The wolf builds a picture of a creature it has never laid eyes on, drawn entirely from the molecules it leaves behind on the cold air. A portrait painted in smell, hanging invisible over the snow. And the ears that turn above that muzzle are nearly its equal, able to catch a sound from kilometers off and to hear the high small registers, the rustle of a mouse beneath the snow that falls silent to us long before they reach our ears. And wrapped around all of this, holding the whole long-distance machine warm against the worst the world can offer, is the coat. It is not one layer, but two. Closest to the skin lies the underfur, dense and soft and fine, growing in thick through the autumn until it forms a deep insulating blanket that traps a still layer of warm air against the body. Over it lie the guard hairs, longer, coarser, water-shedding, standing out from the underfur and turning aside the snow and the rain so the warmth beneath stays dry. Together, they make the wolf almost indifferent to cold that would kill nearly anything else its size. A wolf can curl into a shallow hollow in the open, tuck its nose beneath the warm flag of its tail, let the snow drift over it through the night, and sleep in comfort at temperatures of -40 degrees. While the storm moves over the land, it simply rests, breathing slow, the cold pressing in everywhere and reaching it nowhere at all. It is worth pausing here, in the warmth beneath that coat, to feel what kind of thing a wolf's body truly is. It is tempting to read it the way we read a list. Long legs, deep chest, broad feet, keen nose, double coat, as though it were a collection of separate features, each solving its own small problem. But that is not how the wolf came to be, and it is not how it works. Every part answers the same single question, the one question the wolf's whole lineage has been asked in one form or another for tens of millions of years. How do you pursue prey across the longest, coldest, emptiest distances the world can offer and survive the crossing? The toes that lengthen the stride and the heart that fuels it, and the nose that finds the herd and the coat that keeps the body alive through the killing cold are not 5 answers. They are one answer given 5 times over, in 5 different materials. A single coherent solution worked out so slowly across so many lifetimes that no creature ever lived to see it finished. There is something quietly steadying in that, something worth carrying towards sleep. Your own body, lying still and warm beneath its blankets, is its own long answer to its own long questions. Every breath you take tonight drawn by lungs shaped across the same deep time. Your own slow heartbeat keeping its even rhythm in the dark, the way the wolf's does out on the ridge. We are not the wolf, and the wolf is not us, but we are both old in the same way, both carried forward by bodies far more ancient than the brief lives that wear them. And so we leave the wolf where we found it, only now it has begun to move, out past the last of the trees, down the long white slope, into the open country where the snow lies unbroken to the horizon. It settles into its trot, that easy rolling gait that asks for almost nothing and gives back hour upon hour of distance, and the night swallows it gently. There is no hurry in any of it. There is only the soft fall of paws on snow, the breath rising and vanishing, the warmth held close beneath the fur, and the long dark land opening ahead. A body built for 1,000 miles, moving quietly into the night it was made for. There is a stillness that settles over a snow-filled hollow at the edge of the trees, the kind of quiet where you can hear the smallest sounds, the faint creak of a branch under its weight of frost, the soft give of new snow, and somewhere within that hollow, the slow breathing of animals that have known one another all their lives. A wolf pack at rest is not a gathering of strangers held together by force. It is a family. For a long time, the old stories told it differently, describing a rigid ladder of dominance, an alpha that fought its way to the top and ruled the rest through threat and submission. But that picture came from wolves crowded together in captivity, unrelated animals pressed into a space they would never have chosen. And it tells us very little about how wolves actually live in the wide, cold world they were made for. In the wild, a pack is most often something far gentler and far more familiar. A breeding pair and their children, the young of 1 or 2 seasons still traveling with their parents, learning the land, learning the work, learning the language of their own kind. The wolf you might picture as a fearsome leader is, far more truly, simply a mother and a father, and the animals around them are their sons and their daughters. The bond that holds the pack together is not fear, it is kinship, the same quiet pull that draws any family to keep close through a long winter. Imagine that hollow in the snow, the parents at its center and the young pressed warm against them. And you are imagining something not so different from the oldest shape of belonging that you yourself carry. This is the deep architecture of wolf life, and from it everything else flows. The hunt, the howl, the marking of the land, the long journeys of the young when their time finally comes to leave. And leave they do, for a pack is not a fixed and permanent thing, but something that forms and dissolves and forms again across the turning of years. A wolf is born into its family and grows within it, and for a season or 2 it stays, helping to raise the next litter, learning to read a herd, learning the boundaries of the territory it was born into. But somewhere between its first year and its third, a restlessness begins to move in the young wolf, and one day it simply goes. This is dispersal, the great quiet drama of wolf life, and it is one of the most extraordinary journeys in all the natural world. A dispersing wolf leaves behind everything it has known, its parents, its siblings, the only land it has ever walked, and sets out alone into territory that belongs to other packs, where it is unwelcome and at risk, searching for 2 things it cannot find at home: an empty stretch of country and a mate. Some of these lone travelers cover distances that are difficult to hold in the mind. Wolves have been tracked walking hundreds of kilometers from the place they were born, across mountain ranges, around the edges of frozen lakes, through forests and over open tundra, a single set of tracks pressing on through the snow for weeks. One young wolf, fitted with a tracking collar, wandered so far across the northern world that biologists could scarcely believe the line its path drew across the map, crossing whole countries, swimming rivers swollen with meltwater, threading between the territories of strangers without ever pausing long enough to be challenged. And when at last such a wanderer meets another lone wolf, traveling the same hopeful solitary road, the 2 may settle together in an unclaimed valley and become the founding pair of an entirely new pack. And the whole pattern begins again. The family reforming from 2 animals who left their own families behind. There is something in this that touches very close to home. The leaving and the searching and the founding of something new. A rhythm older than any of us, and yet entirely our own. Now let the imagination lift from the hollow and out across the dark valley, because a pack scattered through such a vast country needs a way to find one another across the distance. And so we come to the sound that is, for most of us, the very voice of the wild. The howl rises into the cold air, long and rising and falling, and it carries. On a still night, across open terrain, a single howl can travel 5, even 10 kilometers, reaching the ears of wolves far beyond the horizon. And it is not merely a sound. It is a message dense with meaning. Wolves can recognize one another by voice alone. A howl carries the identity of the animal that made it, so that members of a pack scattered across a hunting range can know precisely who is calling and from which direction. A howl can summon the pack back together after the work of the day has pulled it apart. It can announce to any neighboring pack listening from across a ridge that this land is held, that a family lives here and intends to remain. And it carries something harder to name, a quality of feeling, a kind of emotional weather, so that wolves howl differently in greeting and in grief, in the loose, joyful chorus that erupts when a scattered pack reunites, and in the long, single note of an animal that has lost its companions. When a whole pack howls together, each voice pitched a little apart from the others, the sound seems somehow larger than the number of animals making it. A deliberate confusion that makes a small family seem like a multitude to any rival listening in the dark. Imagine lying in that hollow as the first voice begins, low and uncertain, and then another joins, and another, until the whole valley seems to be singing. And then, as suddenly as it began, the silence returns and the snow goes on falling as if nothing had happened at all. But the howl reaches only as far as the air will carry it, and the wolf has another, slower language, written not in sound but in scent, a language that lingers in the land long after the animal that wrote it has moved on. As a pack travels the edges of its territory, the wolves leave marks, scent from glands, and most of all, the sharp signatures left at carefully chosen posts along the trails and at the corners of their range. To a human nose, this is nothing, or next to nothing. But to a wolf, the landscape is covered in writing. Each mark carries the identity of the animal that left it, and something of its age and condition, and crucially the time that has passed since it was made. For a scent fades on a schedule a wolf can read as surely as you might read the hands of a clock. Travel the boundary of a territory and the marks grow thick and frequent, laid down again and again so that no wandering stranger can mistake where one family's country ends and another's begins. It is an invisible map, drawn across hundreds of square kilometers, redrawn constantly as the pack patrols, and it does a quiet and merciful work. It allows neighboring packs to keep their distance, to know one another's whereabouts without ever meeting, to avoid the costly violence of a true confrontation. Most of the borders between wolf families are kept not by tooth and claw, but by this patient correspondence of scent, a buffer of unmarked ground between territories where wolves of neither pack care to linger. The wolf, so often imagined as a creature of raw conflict, turns out to spend a great deal of its life avoiding it, reading the messages left by its neighbors and choosing again and again to turn away. And there is one more thing that holds the pack together, something that has nothing to do with the serious business of hunting or borders or survival, and it is perhaps the most surprising of all. Wolves play. They play as puppies, tumbling and chasing and gnawing at one another in the mouth of the den, and remarkably, they go on playing as adults, long after they are full-grown hunters capable of bringing down an animal many times their size. A wolf inviting another to play performs a gesture you would know at once if you have ever lived with a dog. The front legs folded low to the ground, the chest dropped almost to the snow, the hindquarters raised, the tail loose and high, the whole body saying plainly and unmistakably that what follows is not in earnest, that the teeth about to flash will not really bite, and the chase about to begin is only a game. From that bow comes the chase, the mock battle, the wrestling in the snow, The great loping games of pursuit that wind through the trees and out across an open meadow with no purpose at all beyond the doing of it. And yet there is purpose in it, of a deeper kind. Play is how the bonds of the family are tested and renewed, how the young learn the strength and the limits of their own bodies, how trust is built and rebuilt among animals who must, when the season turns serious, depend upon one another utterly. A pack that plays together is a pack that will hunt together and stay together and raise its young together through the lean months. In the play of wolves, there is a kind of joy that asks nothing and means everything. The same loose delight you might recognize in the games of any creature glad simply to be alive among its own. So gather all of it now. The family in the hollow, the young wolf walking alone across the snow toward a life it cannot yet see, the marks laid quietly along the boundary trails, the great loping games beneath the trees, and listen once more to the howl rising from a hillside somewhere tonight. It is not simply a sound thrown into the dark. It is a sentence in a language far older than any human word, carrying identity and longing and belonging across a darkness that has not changed in 10,000 years, spoken by a family to a family, by one warm gathering of breathing animals to all the others scattered through the cold. And all of this grammar, all of this patient social work, the calling and the answering, the leaving and the founding, the borders kept in peace and the games played for their own sake, all of it exists for a single purpose that waits just beyond the edge of this quiet hour. The moment when the family rises together and moves, as one, out into the night to hunt. There is a stillness that comes before a wolf ever begins to run, and it is the deepest part of the hunt. Imagine the pack arriving at the crest of a low ridge in the blue half-light of a winter dusk, the snow stretching out below them in a long pale sweep, and across that sweep a herd of elk standing in the open, their breath rising in faint columns into the cold. The wolves do not rush. They lower themselves into the snow, or they sit and they watch. For a long while nothing seems to happen at all. To a passing eye it might look like rest, like a row of grey shapes simply sharing the warmth of one another against the falling temperature. But this is the most important work the pack will do tonight, and it is the work of reading. Every wolf on that ridge is taking in the herd the way you might take in the face of someone you have known for years, noticing not the obvious things but the small ones, the almost invisible ones. Which animal lifts its head a beat too slowly? Which one favors a leg when it shifts its weight? Which calf stays a little too close to its mother? And which old cow has begun to drift, without quite meaning to, toward the edge of the group? The hunt has already begun, here in this long quiet looking, and not a single muscle has yet been spent. This patience is not idleness. It is the oldest kind of intelligence the wolf possesses, refined across more winters than the mind can easily hold. A herd of elk or moose is not a collection of equal targets. It is a landscape of risk and reward, and the wolf reads that landscape with a fluency that took the lineage millions of years to acquire. A healthy adult elk in its prime is an enormous and dangerous animal, capable of breaking a wolf's ribs or its skull with a single kick, and the pack knows this in a way that runs deeper than thought. So they look for the animal whose body has already begun, quietly, to fail. They look for the old, whose joints have stiffened and whose wind is short. They look for the very young, who cannot yet run with the herd. They look for the sick, the lame, the wounded, the ones in whom some small wrongness has begun to show. This is not cruelty, and it is not mercy. It is simply the arithmetic of survival, the calculation that every predator must make between the energy a chase will cost and the meal it might or might not yield. And in making that calculation, again and again, across countless generations, the wolf becomes something more than a hunter. It becomes a kind of editor of the herd itself. For the herd, strange as it may seem, is shaped by this reading. Over long stretches of time, the wolves take disproportionately the slow and the unwell, and so the animals that survive to breed are, on average, the swift and the sound. The predator presses upon the prey a constant, gentle pressure toward health, toward speed, toward vigilance. The elk that startles at the right moment, the moose that holds its ground at the right moment, the deer whose senses are a fraction sharper than its neighbors. These are the ones who pass their lives forward into the next generation. There is an old truth, almost too large to feel, hidden inside this slow exchange. The wolf and the elk have been making one another for far longer than either has had a name. The speed of the deer is written by the wolf that pursued it. The patience of the wolf is written by the deer that escaped. Each is the other's long, unhurried sculptor, and the herd standing in the snow below the ridge is, in a sense, a portrait drawn by 100,000 winters of careful looking. And then, at last, the reading ends and the moving begins. There is no signal a human eye could name, no command, only some shared threshold crossed at once, and the pack flows down off the ridge and out across the open snow. Even now there is no frenzy. The wolves move with a long, economical purpose, fanning toward the herd, and the herd lifts as one and turns and runs, and in that first surge the whole question of the night is decided in moments. For the herd's defense is the herd itself. So long as the elk run together, packed and pounding, the wolves can find no single animal to single out, and a wolf cannot bring down a wall of moving bodies. So the pack runs not to overtake the herd, but to read it once more, at speed now, watching for the one that falls a length behind, the one whose stride has the smallest catch in it, the one the others are, without choosing to, leaving behind. Most often, the herd holds. Most hunts end here, in the simple fact of failure. The wolves slowing, the herd drawing slowly away into the distance, the snow settling, the pack standing in the dusk with empty mouths, and the patient understanding that there will be another dusk, and another after that. It is worth letting that sink in. The great predator of the northern world, the architect of the herd, fails far more often than it succeeds. Hunger is the wolf's ordinary weather. The kill is the exception, and the long hunger between kills is the rule. But sometimes the reading holds true, and the chase finds its animal. The end, when it comes, is quieter than the imagination expects. There is no drama in it for the wolves, no triumph. There is only the close of a long calculation and the beginning of food. What follows the kill is its own small society. The pack feeds, and the feeding has an order to it, the breeding pair and the strong often first, but with far less rigidity than the old stories claimed, pups pressing in among the adults, the whole family gathered close in the cold, around the one great gift the night has given. And at the edges of that gathering, others wait. Ravens drop down out of the grey air, having followed the pack for hours, sometimes for days. Foxes circle at a careful distance. An eagle may stand off in the snow with his terrible patience. A single elk in the deep of winter is not one meal, but many, sustaining the pack across several days, and feeding, at its margins, a whole quiet community of scavengers who live, in a sense, on the wolf's skill. Nothing here is wasted. The bones are cracked and the marrow taken, the hide stripped, The snow around the killside darkened and trampled and softened by the warmth of the gathered bodies, and then, in time, covered over again by fresh fall, until only the ravens remember where it was. It is tempting to think the wolf's story ends at the kill, that this is the whole of what a predator does. But the deepest fact of the hunt reaches far beyond the single animal in the snow, far beyond the pack, out into the very shape of the land, for the wolves, simply by being present, change where the elk dare to linger. A herd that knows wolves are reading the ridges does not graze idly in the open valley bottoms, does not stand for hours in one soft place by the water cropping the young willows down to stubs. It keeps moving. It stays alert. It avoids the places where the ground is bad for running, the low riverbanks where the brush is thick and an ambush might wait. And in that one change, in the simple restlessness of a watchful herd, the world begins slowly to rearrange itself. This is the thing ecologists came to call the trophic cascade, the long chain of consequence that runs downward from the predator to the smallest growing thing. And it is one of the most beautiful ideas in all of natural history. The wolf does not plant a single tree. It only watches and waits, and now and then runs. And yet across decades that watching reshapes forests, returns birdsong to valleys gone silent, and bends the very courses of rivers. The clearest place this was ever seen lies in the high valleys of Yellowstone, in the northwest of the American continent, where the wolves had been gone for the better part of 70 years. When they were brought back in 1995, the elk that had grown careless across those long, undisturbed decades grew watchful again. They stopped loitering along the streamsides. They stopped browsing the young willows and aspens down to nothing. And within only a few years, those streamside trees began to rise again, green and tall, where for 2 generations there had been only cropped and stunted growth. With the willows came the beavers, who build with willow and whose dams slow and spread the water. With the slowed water came pools and wetlands and the patient creatures that live in them. And with the stabilized root-bound banks, the rivers themselves began to wander less, to hold their channels, to carve and meander in the old patient way. The land, in a real and measurable sense, changed its shape. And it did so because a few dozen wolves had returned to watching the herds from the hills. It is almost too much to believe, and yet the willows are there, and the beavers are there, and the rivers run as they run. So when you picture the wolf tonight, picture it not only as the runner in the snow, but as the long, quiet pressure that shapes a living world. Somewhere in the dark, even now, a pack lies on a ridge above a moonlit valley, reading a herd it may never chase. And far below, unknowing, a river bends a little differently because of the patient grey eyes watching from above. Let that thought settle softly over you, slow as falling snow, as the night carries us gently onward. Somewhere in the high Canadian Arctic tonight, a wolf, the colour of old snow, is lying still on a ridge of wind-packed ice, and the cold around it is a thing with weight, a vast and patient cold that has settled over the land the way it settles over the land every winter, the way it has settled for longer than anyone could count. The wolf's breath rises in a thin, slow plume. Its fur is so pale it nearly disappears against the white, and its ears are small and rounded, its legs shorter than you might expect, its whole shape quietly folded inward against the loss of heat, because here, at the very top of the world, the wolf has been carved by the cold into something compact and economical, something built to lose as little warmth as the body can manage. This is the Arctic wolf, and it walks across one of the loneliest landscapes on Earth. a place of permanent silence and endless horizon. And yet, it is only one expression of a single animal, one face among many, of a creature that once spread itself across more of the planet than almost any other large mammal that has ever lived. Imagine for a moment the full reach of that range. Picture the grey wolf not as it is now, but as it was, present across nearly the entire northern half of the world, from the frozen tundra of the high Arctic down through the boreal forests, across the Great Plains and the mountain ranges, into the deserts of Arabia, into the dry hills of Mexico, into the forests of India and the high passes of the Himalaya. For a long stretch of time, the grey wolf was the most widely distributed large land mammal on Earth, more widespread than the lion, more widespread than the bear, found across an arc of the planet so enormous that no single pack, no single wolf, could ever have known more than the smallest fragment of it. And across all that range, the wolf did not stay the same. It bent itself to fit each place, slowly, across generations, until the single animal had become a mosaic of forms, each one shaped by the particular weather and prey and ground of the country it called home. Consider the variety that emerged from that long shaping. On the open grasslands of North America, once moved the Great Plains wolf, a strong, broad-skulled animal that followed the bison herds across distances the mind struggles to hold. Further north and west ranges the northwestern wolf, sometimes called the Mackenzie Valley wolf, among the largest of all the grey wolves on the continent, heavy through the shoulders, built for the deep snow and the large prey of the boreal north. And then there is the Arctic wolf of the Canadian high Arctic, the pale animal on the ridge, with its white coat and its reduced extremities, its short ears and short muzzle, every part of it quietly redesigned to hold warmth in a place where warmth is the rarest thing of all. Far to the south and east, across the dry plains and scrublands of the Indian subcontinent, moves the Indian wolf, smaller and leaner, with a thin coat suited to heat rather than cold. And higher still, up among the thin air and the cold rock of the Himalaya and the Tibetan Plateau, lives the Himalayan wolf, an animal that scientists have come to understand as something genetically ancient and distinct, a lineage that branched away long ago and carries adaptations in its very blood for breathing in air where the oxygen runs thin. There was once, too, a wolf of Mexico and the American Southwest, the small, warm-colored Mexican wolf, moving through the pine-clad mountains and high deserts of that dry country, the southernmost of all the grey wolves, shaped by a gentler winter and a sparser land. These are not different animals so much as different sentences spoken in the same old language, each one a variation on the single deep theme of what it means to be a wolf. Hold them all together in the mind for a moment, the pale and the tawny and the lean and the heavy. And what you are really holding is the patient handiwork of time, the slow pressure of countless winters and summers shaping a single creature into 100 subtle keys. Now let your mind travel east, into the great forests of Siberia and the Russian north, where the taiga stretches so far and so unbroken that human presence is measured not in cities, but in small towns separated by hundreds of kilometers of trees, an ocean of spruce and larch and pine rolling on past the edge of imagination. Through that immense forest moves the tiger wolf, among the largest grey wolves alive anywhere in the world, a powerful animal moving through a powerful land, its tracks pressed into snow that may not see a single human footprint for an entire winter. Imagine the scale of the solitude there. Imagine a wolf trotting for night after night beneath the dark crowns of trees, crossing frozen rivers, threading through country so vast that the pack might travel for days without reaching its edge. It is one of the last places on Earth where an animal can still move through a world that is more or less the world as it has always been, where the forest answers to the seasons and the wolves and little else, and where the deep, old rhythm of predator and prey continues much as it has for hundreds of thousands of years. There is something steadying in knowing such a place still exists, that somewhere beyond every road and every wire, there is still a country wide enough for a wolf to be entirely, simply, a wolf, and to walk for 100 kilometers beneath the trees without ever once crossing the trace of a human hand. And then, against all of that immensity, hold the opposite image. Far away from the snow and the endless forest, in the rocky wadis and sun-bleached hillsides of the Middle East, there lives a wolf you might not at first recognize as a wolf at all. The Arabian wolf is small, far smaller than its northern cousins, with short, thin fur that lies close against the body and large ears that fan the heat away. An animal shaped not by cold, but by its absence, by the long, bright, burning days of the desert. It survives in dry ravines and stony hills, moving in smaller groups, sometimes nearly alone, taking what the desert offers in a land where life is spread thin across the rock. And here is the quiet marvel of it. The same lineage that produced the heavy, pale Arctic wolf on its ridge of ice also produced this lean, large-eared creature padding across hot stone under a desert moon. The wolf form, which can seem so fixed, so singular in the mind, turns out to be remarkably flexible, capable of stretching itself to fit a span of climates that runs from -40 degrees on the tundra to the blistering heat of an Arabian afternoon. One animal, one ancient blueprint, and yet so many ways of wearing it. There is one more story worth holding tonight, and it is a gentler one, a story of return rather than reach. In the mountains of Italy, not so very long ago, the wolf came perilously close to vanishing altogether. By the 1970s, the Italian wolf, the slender, tawny wolf of the Apennine Mountains, had been reduced to fewer than 100 animals, a thin scattering of survivors clinging to the highest and wildest ridges of the peninsula, the last of a population that had once been spread across the whole country. It would have been easy then to believe the story was ending, and yet it did not end. Slowly, quietly, with protection, and with time, those few wolves began to recover, and their numbers climbed from the dozens into the hundreds, and then into the thousands. And the wolves did what wolves have always done. They walked. They moved north along the spine of the mountains, and then up into the Alps, and then beyond, crossing back into France, into Switzerland, into Germany, even reaching, in time, the Low Countries to the north, returning on their own 4 feet to valleys that had not heard a howl in 100 years and more. No one carried them. No one released them there. They simply walked back into a world that had largely forgotten them, following the old roads written into their blood. And so the map of the wolf today is, in truth, a map of loss and a map of persistence held together in the same lines. The world that wolves now inhabit is only a fraction of the world they once knew, a scattering of strongholds, where once there was an unbroken sweep across half a planet. The deserts of Arabia hold only a remnant. The Great Plains have gone quiet where the plains wolf once followed the herds. Many a forest that once carried a howl now carries only the memory of one. There is real grief folded into that contraction, the grief of a sound subtracted from countless landscapes. And yet the howl still rises tonight from an Italian hillside, where 2 centuries ago it had fallen silent. It still carries across the valleys of Yellowstone, and across the taiga, and across the high white silence of the Arctic, where the pale wolf lies on its ridge. The animal that was nearly erased from so much of its range has, in places, found its way back, has held on in others, has persisted, against the long odds of the modern world, in carrying its ancient form forward into another night. That persistence, that quiet refusal to vanish, is itself a kind of deep time endurance, the same patient holding on that carried the lineage through ice ages and through the rise and fall of whole worlds of creatures. The wolf has always been an animal of the long view, of distances and durations larger than a single life, and it remains so now, scattered but unbroken, walking still across the ranges that are left to it, under the same cold and ancient stars, around a fire somewhere in the long northern night, 1,000 and more years ago. The flames lean and gutter, and out beyond the small ring of warmth, the dark goes on without edge or end. Somewhere in that dark a wolf is moving, and the people gathered close to the light know it, and the knowing settles into them and becomes a story. This is where we find the wolf now, for a little while. Not in the fossil beds or the frozen steppe, but in the fire-lit space inside the human mind, where for as long as there have been people to tell stories, there has been a wolf in them. Almost every culture that ever shared a landscape with the grey wolf left some account of it, and the accounts are rarely simple. The wolf, in the old tellings, is never merely an animal. It is wildness given a shape, the thing that lives at the edge of the warm and the known, the breath that moves across the snow when the fire has burned low. In the cold of the Norse north, they told of Fenrir, the great wolf bound by the gods with a ribbon woven from impossible things, a creature so vast and so feared that even the powers of the world could only hope to delay it. Far to the south, on 7 warm hills beside a river, the Romans told a gentler tale. A she-wolf who found 2 abandoned infants and warmed them and let them nurse at her side. And from those children, the story said, a whole city grew. Here is the wolf in both its faces at once, the same animal in the same human imagination. On one hand, the devourer waiting at the end of things, and on the other, the patient mother who keeps the helpless alive through the cold. That doubleness runs through nearly all of it. The wolf threatens, and the wolf founds. It is the danger in the dark and somehow the source of something that endures. Imagine, for a moment, how easily both stories could belong to the same firelit evening, told by the same voice, neither one cancelling the other. For long centuries the stories sat alongside the living animal, and people and wolves shared the land in an uneasy, ordinary way. But as the medieval world in Europe grew more crowded, as more of the forest was cleared for fields and flocks, the older ambivalence began to harden into something narrower. The wolf became, above all, the enemy of the fold, the shadow at the edge of the pasture, and the long campaign against it began. It was a slow and patient undoing, carried out across generations. There were bounties offered for every wolf brought in, sums of money set against a life, so that hunting wolves became a thing a person could do for a living. There were wolf pits dug into the ground and hidden, and traps set along the trails, and across whole kingdoms officials, whose work was simply the removal of the animal from the land. It did not happen quickly, but it happened thoroughly. In England, the wolf was pressed back and back until it was gone, and then pressed out of Wales, and the woods that had held wolves for hundreds of thousands of years held them no longer. Across France, across the German lands, across most of Central Europe, the same quiet emptying took place across the centuries, until by the 1700s and the 1800s, vast stretches of the continent had fallen wolfless. There is no drama to set against this in the telling, only a kind of silence spreading outward. A sound leaving the world one valley at a time, so gradually that no single night could be named as the one when it ended. A forest does not announce the moment it loses its wolves. It simply grows quieter, season by season, until the quiet is all that anyone remembers. Imagine standing on a Scottish hillside in the early 1700s, in the thin grey light before dawn, the heather wet underfoot, and the air carrying nothing but wind. By tradition, though the records are uncertain and the tellings disagree, it was somewhere in the Scottish Highlands in those years that the last wolf in Britain died. The exact place is lost, the exact year disputed, the story half folklore by the time anyone thought to write it down. But the shape of it is true enough. A sound that had been part of that landscape since before there were people to hear it. A voice that had crossed those glens through ice ages and warm ages alike simply stopped. After that, the hills held their silence. A child born on those slopes in the years that followed would grow old never once hearing a wolf, and would have no way of knowing what had gone missing, because you cannot miss a thing you have never known was there. That is perhaps the quietest kind of loss there is. Not a sudden absence, but a slow forgetting. The landscape itself letting go of a sound it had carried for longer than memory could reach. The wolf passed out of Britain and into story alone, surviving only in the old words, in place names worn smooth by time, in the tales told to children about the dark beyond the door. Across the wide ocean, on the grasslands, and in the mountain ranges of the American West, the same long silence fell, though it came later and faster. For most of the deep history of that continent, the wolf had been everywhere, woven into the great herds, ranging from the northern forests down across the open plains. Then, within only a few generations, it was almost entirely undone. As the open country was fenced and given over to cattle, the wolf was recast once more as an enemy, and a campaign of removal was carried out across the whole breadth of the land. Poison was laid out across the plains, strychnine folded into the carcasses left as bait, and steel traps were set along the game trails in their countless thousands. It was deliberate, and it was nearly complete. By around the 1940s, the grey wolf had been all but erased from the lower 48 states of America, gone from the plains where its family had first taken shape tens of millions of years before, gone from the very nursery of the dog lineage. A creature that had once been the most widely ranging large land animal on the entire earth had been pressed into a few last northern fragments, and across the heart of a continent, the howl fell still. The same story, in the end, that had played out across Europe. The same slow emptying, the same silence settling into hills and valleys that had known the sound since before the ice. And yet the stories never left, even where the animal did. Long after the last wolf had gone quiet in Britain, the tales remained. In the fireside warnings, in the figure at the edge of the old folk tales, in the grandmother's voice and the shadow in the wood. People went on telling stories about wolves in lands where no living person had ever seen one, which is itself a strange and telling thing. We do not, as a rule, keep such company with the creatures we have driven away. We forget most of them, but the wolf we kept, in language and in memory, long past the point where keeping it served any purpose at all. Perhaps the reason is simple, and it sits at the heart of everything the old tellers half understood. Every culture that ever lived alongside the wolf left a story about it, and they did so, very likely, because the wolf almost alone among the wild animals of the world, looked back. It met the human gaze across the firelight and held it, with eyes that seemed to carry something the watcher recognized. A family bound together, a voice raised in the dark, a hunger and a patience not so unlike our own. And so even after the silence fell across the northern world, the wolf went on living where it had perhaps always lived most fully, in the imagination of the very creature that had learned so long ago to share the night with it. Imagine a grey morning in the high country of the American West, frost still holding the grass stiff, the air so cold it seems to ring, and a single set of paw prints pressed into snow where, for most of a lifetime, there had been none at all. For 70 years that ground had known no wolf. The herds had grown comfortable and unwary. The willows along the streams had thinned to brittle remnants, and the silence on the ridges had become so ordinary that almost no one remembered it as an absence. And then very quietly, the prince returned, and the land began, slowly, to remember what it had forgotten. The story of how those prints came back is one of the gentlest turns in the whole long history of the wolf, and it begins not with a howl, but with a piece of law. In the year 1973, the United States passed the Endangered Species Act, and for the first time, the grey wolf, which had been hunted and poisoned to the very edge of disappearance across the lower 48 states, was given the legal shelter to survive. It is easy to pass over a law as something dry and distant, but for the wolf, this one was scaffolding. A quiet framework holding open a door that had been closing for 2 centuries. Protection did not bring the wolves back on its own. It simply made their return possible, and possibility for an animal as patient and far-ranging as the wolf is sometimes all that is needed. The years that followed were years of preparation, of biologists studying maps and herds and the slow arithmetic of how a vanished predator might be invited home. It is worth pausing here in the warmth of that idea, that a creature could be welcomed back into a world that had spent generations trying to be rid of it. Across millions of years, the wolf had crossed land bridges and ice sheets and whole continents entirely on its own, asking nothing of anyone. This time, for the first time in all that long history, it would be carried part of the way by the very species that had once driven it out. In the deep cold of January, in the year 1995, the door that the law had held open finally swung wide. 14 wolves were captured in the wild forests of Alberta in Western Canada, where wolves had never stopped running, and they were carried south, across a border that means nothing to a wolf, into the valleys of Yellowstone National Park. Picture the strangeness of that journey for the animals themselves, lifted out of the only landscape they had ever known and set down in another, in crates, in the hands of a species they had every reason to fear. They were held for a time in pens, allowed to grow used to the smell and the sound and the unfamiliar shape of the new country, and then, on a winter day, watched by biologists and ranchers and conservationists with equal and opposite intensity, the gates were opened and the wolves stepped out onto Yellowstone snow. No fanfare reached them. They simply walked into the trees, paused once at the edge of the timber, breath rising in pale clouds against the cold, and then were gone, slipping into a wilderness their kind had not walked in living memory, and the long experiment began. What happened next unfolded across the following decade, and it unfolded more quickly and more completely than almost anyone had dared to hope. The elk, which for 70 undisturbed years had grazed the streamsides down to the dirt, lingering wherever they pleased, suddenly had to think again about where they stood and for how long. They began to move, to avoid the open valley bottoms where a pack could close in, to keep to the higher and safer ground. And along the streams they had abandoned, the willows and the aspens, released at last from the endless browsing, began to grow. Within just a few years the riverbanks were greening, branches rising where there had been bare mud, and with the willows came other lives. Songbirds returned to nest in the new growth, their small voices threading once more through the cottonwoods. Beavers, which need willow to build and to eat, moved back into the valleys, and their dams slowed the water, spread it into ponds, cooled it for fish and frogs. The wolves had not touched the rivers, they had touched the elk, and the elk had touched the land, and the land had remade its own waters. It is one of the most quietly astonishing things in all of ecology, this idea that a single returning predator can ripple outward until it changes the very shape of a valley, the bend of a stream, the color of a hillside. And it happened not in deep time, but within the span of an ordinary human memory. While the wolves of Yellowstone were being carried home, something subtler and even more remarkable was happening on the far side of the world, with no hand to guide it at all. In the mountains of Italy, a small and stubborn population of wolves had survived the long centuries of persecution, hidden in the Apennine spine of the country, reduced at their lowest point to perhaps only 100 animals. And as the laws across Europe shifted toward protection, those wolves began, entirely on their own, to do what wolves have always done. They dispersed. Young wolves, leaving the packs of their birth, walked north along the chain of the mountains, crossing ridges and rivers, threading between towns, padding across motorways in the dark and slipping past the lights of ski resorts until they arrived in valleys that hadn't heard a howl in 200 years. They reached Switzerland, then France, then Germany, and farther still, all without a single crate or a single biologist to carry them. They simply walked back into the world, following the old logic written into them across millions of years, that where there is space and prey, a wolf will eventually come. There is a particular wonder in that, in the thought of an animal recolonizing a continent on foot, generation by generation, asking no permission and waiting for no ceremony. It tells us that the wolf's range had not truly been erased, only pressed into hiding, and that given the smallest opening, it would expand again, with the quiet persistence of water finding its level. And this is perhaps the deepest truth of the whole return, the thing worth carrying into the dark with you tonight. The wolves that walked into Yellowstone in the winter of 1995 were not symbols, and they were not gestures. They were answers, living answers, to a question the ecosystem itself had been asking, patiently and without words, for 70 long years. The land had been incomplete, and it had been waiting, and when the wolves returned, the answer slotted back into place, as though it had never truly left. Across the whole of the wolf's immense history, through the warm Eocene forests and the grinding ice ages and the long centuries of being driven out, there had never been a chapter quite like this one, in which the animal that vanishes is at last allowed to come home. And so somewhere tonight, in a valley that stood empty for generations, a pack moves through the snow that belongs to it once more, leaving prints that no longer mark an absence, but a quiet and lasting return. High on the ridge again, where this whole night began, the air is cold enough to feel like something solid, and the snow holds the last of the day's blue light in its folds. A howl rises into that darkness, long and low and unhurried, climbing through the still air the way it has climbed for longer than we can easily imagine. But you hear it differently now. You know, as you settle deeper into the warmth around you, that this sound did not begin tonight, and it did not begin in any year a person could name. It came up out of deep time, carried on the breath of a creature whose shape was rehearsed across an almost unthinkable span of the Earth's long story. Imagine the whole of it gathered into that single rising note. The same voice, in one form or another, has been lifting into cold northern skies since long before the first human shelter was ever built. Think back, slowly, across everything this quiet journey has carried you through. There were the warm Eocene forests of roughly 50 million years ago, where small, weasel-like creatures moved through the canopy, their ankles already learning the flexibility that a wolf would one day need to cross a frozen plain. There were the open grasslands where the first true dogs, no larger than a fox, trotted in the shadow of vanished giants. There were the Ice Age corridors of steppe and tundra, stretching unbroken from the cliffs of Ireland to the rivers of Siberia, where wolves heavier than any alive today moved among mammoths and woolly rhinoceroses, and the great deer with antlers spanning the width of a room. All of it under a world of permanent winter twilight. And through all of it, one lineage held its shape. It bent and adjusted and softened at the edges, but it never broke. The genus Canis appeared some 6 or 7 million years ago. True grey wolves stepped quietly into the fossil record roughly 300,000 years before our time, unremarked by any witness, and they have been with the world ever since. That is what you are hearing on the ridge tonight. Not simply an animal calling across a valley, but a living thread drawn taut through the whole of Earth's recent memory. The same body that learned to run across the longest, coldest distances the world could offer. The same nose that can read a single deer from far downwind. The same deep, narrow chest, built around a tireless heart, carrying the wolf at its steady trot through the dark. Picture that one continuous line, unbroken, stretching from the Eocene forests to the Ice Age tundra, to the rewilded valleys of the present, where wolves have walked back on their own into places that had been silent for 200 years. It is one of the oldest sounds still being made on this planet, and it is being made somewhere right now. And now imagine where that sound goes when it falls quiet. Picture the pack itself, somewhere far to the north, settling for the night. They have travelled a long way through the cold, and now they curl into a hollow scooped from the snow, pressed close together for warmth, nose tucked beneath tail, the family folded into a single dark shape against the white. Their breath rises in small, slow clouds and drifts away into the dark. The wind moves once across the ridge and then is still. Now and then, one of them shifts, resettling against the others, and then is still again. There is no urgency in any of it. There is only the deep, even rhythm of breathing, the gentle rise and fall of animals at rest, completely at peace in a landscape that asks nothing more of them tonight. They are not waiting for anything. They are simply, perfectly asleep. You can settle alongside that stillness now. Let your own breath find the same slow rhythm, the long, unhurried exhale of a creature that has stopped at last, and let the weight of the day go soft. There is nothing left to hold. The wolves have carried their lineage across tens of millions of years without ever once needing to think about it, and the world has turned through warm ages and cold ages and turned again. And here you are, breathing quietly in the dark, part of the same long living story. Somewhere tonight, under the same stars that hang over your roof, a wolf is breathing slowly in the snow, and it has been doing exactly that in one form or another for longer than the mind can comfortably hold. There is something quietly restful in being so small against something so very old. in knowing the night does not depend on you. You do not have to carry any of it. You only have to rest. So let the howl fade now, the way all sounds eventually fade, softening into the cold and the distance until it becomes part of the silence itself. The ridge will still be there. The snow will go on holding its faint blue light, and far off in the dark, the slow breathing of the pack will continue, steady and untroubled, all the way through to morning. Thank you for spending this quiet stretch of the night here, for letting these old, unhurried things keep you company as the day let go of you. It has been a gentle honor to sit with you in the dark. There is nothing more for you to do. Close your eyes, if they are not already closed, and let yourself drift down into sleep the way the snow drifts down onto the ridge, slowly, softly, without any effort at all. Rest now, rest deeply, and rest well. The world will still be here when you wake, just as it has always been, deep and old and unhurried, turning quietly through the dark while you sleep. And somewhere out in that vast and ancient world, a wolf